Hello, everybody, and welcome to another A Tippling Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce, and my good friend Aaron Adair, Dr. Aaron Adair. Don't want to forget the qualification there. I am super excited to talk to Aaron tonight about, well, hopefully hear him talk to us about Moses, because for the first reason, he and we are both in the middle of writing a book. Actually, it's a book that I started probably 3 years ago now. That I've written sort of half of it and waiting for a co-author to write the other half, but that hasn't been able to happen. So Aaron has stepped in and is now co-writing that book with me. So he's got that half of the book to write, and it's to do with the Exodus. It's the third book in a trilogy of books that I have written. Or no, I haven't written that yet, but the first two are the Nativity, a critical examination, and then the Resurrection, a critical examination of the Easter story, and this will be the Exodus, a critical examination of the Moses story. And the idea is that if you look critically at these, well, these are the bookends of Jesus' life, right? And if you look at the historical claims concerning those events, then you find them wanting. What does that say about the rest of Jesus's existence? And if it's not historically tenable at these either ends where you do have intersection with history, then what does it say about all the stuff in the middle where there is no intersection with history, like the wedding of Cana? Who was there? How do we know? What are the claims? Yada yada yada. It's just mere assertion. Well, if we're justified in thinking that these big events didn't happen, then it's probably unlikely that any of this stuff kind of happened in the middle. Well, it's kind of applying that thought process to the Exodus and looking at it historically, archaeologically, philosophically, and saying, right, if that didn't happen, then what does that say about not just Judaism, but the Christianity upon, which that is built? Anyway, so Aaron has been doing lots of research into characters like Moses, and he's going to present to us a theory that he has, talked to us about that theory and about Moses. Before we start, so that's my long ramble into this, Aaron. Before we start, why is Moses an important character?
Well, it's at this point almost impossible to imagine Judaism without Moses. He is quintessentially so important to that. Perhaps rivaled by Abraham as the father of the Jews or Jewish people, but the idea that Moses basically got to hang out with God face to face, basically provided the laws, all the mitzvah that are the big chunk of books like Leviticus, which is basically the giant list of you're going to do this. And of course, leading his people out of bondage in Egypt to the promised land that Moses himself could never actually enter into. It is so foundational to the stories of where so much of the culture and practices of Judaism are supposed to find themselves in. And because it intersects with history, it's like, okay, then we have the question of if he's going to actually show up in the historical record. Can we find him along with the mass migration that he's supposed to have been leading? And if not, what does that say for all the religions that basically point back to the Moses figure as so foundational? Jesus, of course, is supposed to be like a second Moses, like the Gospel of Matthew goes out of its way to basically like point and say, guys, while John Lennon might be bigger than Jesus, Jesus is bigger than Moses.
Yeah, this is in the same way that in the nativity stories, the idea is that Jesus is a Caesar Augustus times 10. If he can have this crazy birth and this is who Jesus competed with, then Jesus can have a really important superhuman birth, if you like. And then the idea, as you said, Gospel of Matthew, is that Jesus, for the Jews, or the audience of the Jewish people, which is Matthew's audience, is like, I need Jesus to be bigger than the big Jewish characters. Or who do these guys really, really appreciate? Well, Moses, because there are many theorists who would say the entirety of the first 5 books, or well, the entirety of Genesis, really, moving on to Exodus, is moving the Hebrew Bible towards the law. Like, it's all about the law. That's really what the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible is about. So, Jesus needs to be, if Moses is delivering that and is responsible for that coming about, then Jesus needs to be bigger than Moses. So that's what at least the Gospel of Matthew does, is makes Jesus the new Moses, and that's fairly accepted within Christian thought as well, not just secular critical thinking. People like Dale Allison Jr. have written books that saying that Jesus is the new Moses according to Matthew. But so he's super duper important. But as you say, if he doesn't exist, or if we have serious issues with his historicity, then what does that say about all of these other ideas, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And of course, also that traditionally he is also the author of the first 5 books of the Bible. And so if you lose that, and it goes from a person who had face-to-face interactions with God to just some guys and some editors, it also loses a lot of the authority that so many people give to it, whether that's deeply Orthodox Jewish folks, peoples that answers in Genesis. I would assume also in the Islamic world, though I don't know enough about the Islamic take on Moses and his authorial activities, though I would assume it's something close to the traditional view.
Yeah. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through a sort of presentation that Aaron has put together to express his thesis here. Can you add that to the screen, or do you need me to do that?
I have it ready to share, but I think you have to display it. Exactly.
Okay. Is that fine with you?
Yep. And I can embiggen it as well.
Embiggen as much as you like.
All right. So I also given this a bit of title of being Moses is being made rather than found, in a sense, because there's also a bit of a mystery when it comes to Moses, not just of the historical figure and the story of the Exodus and all those sorts of things, but even the very name of Moses actually is of uncertain origin. And trying to figure that out might explain a fair number of other mysteries with this biblical character. So first off, we keep saying Moses, and that's what pretty much everyone in the English world, or speaking most modern European languages, are going to say Moses or something close to that. But that's technically not how you would say his name. In Hebrew, it's Moshe. And the reason we're calling it Moses, or keep saying Moses, is because that's how it gets transliterated into Greek, which then gets translated into Latin, and eventually then into this crazy language that a bunch of people across the pond decided to push onto us good American folk.
Damn straight.
Right, right. But the thing is, this name, while there is an explanation for it in the biblical story, there are issues with it, along with so much else when it comes to the Moses character. So this is going to be a bit of presentation of something that I have submitted an article for. We'll see if it gets published, or after how much revision it finally gets published. But I'm going to basically go through a few of the highlighting points. One is that the attempts to figure out Moses' name are a little bit confused. And this is not like my opinion. This is like the state of the field, like general agreement of the experts and what they have to say about this. Then we'll talk about, well, how do we actually find Moses in the Bible and see how he's developing along with the Exodus tradition, and see that there's actually a really weird observation that was pointed out at first to me by a rabbi on Twitter. And then when I dug into it, I'm like, wow, I did not expect that result. I did not expect that to bear out. And then lastly, I'm going to show you the earliest source that talks about Moses directly, that we can date, that we're certain about when it was written or discussed, and how that might lead to our own getting out of the wilderness.
Yeah, nice. I see what you did. Well, before you start, thank you so much to Constellation Pegasus. Really, really generous of you. Aaron, your presentation on the Chinese tale that was on Myth Vision just recently was really nice. Absolutely. I'm halfway through that at the moment. Thank you for it. Aaron is a bit of an expert on everything, and that's very much what I appreciate about him. But thank you, Constellation Pegasus. Hopefully you'll get something out of this as well.
I'm a jack of all trades, master of none, and so that means everything I do, I fail at in all sorts of new and unique ways. So I do want to repeat that what I'm going to be proposing here, while I think it is justified, and I have passed in front of a couple of experts to get some feedback from it, please take it with several bags of salt. dump it right on top of the thesis, and then see if anything could still grow in that environment. So,
although there
I'm
is
going
a
to try
lot
to
that
give
we'll be
evidence, but
saying that is pretty justifiable around the sides to do with like his life or supposed life and so on and so forth,
yeah,
which isn't as speculative or whatever as you're saying. But anyway, carry on.
yeah, I'm going to try to do my best to say what things are considered solid facts in the field, what things are more tenuous, and then what things I'm proposing and what strengths and weaknesses it has. So I'm going to try to be fair and balanced, and much better than the Fox News way, but still, this is definitely not the sort of thing I'm trained in. My PhD in physics doesn't mean I necessarily know everything. Just because everything is made of atoms and I know the physics of atoms doesn't therefore mean I know everything. I have to say that because some scientists will kind of go down and become crazy like that.
Absolutely.
If I'm crazy like that, it's not because of my physics, it's because of something else. All right. So let's talk about this name. So is this displayed fine right now?
Yeah. That's fine. We can see all the toolbars on the other side, but hey ho.
Oh. I thought that would be hidden by now. I can kill that. Let me make it better. Because I want to make sure I'm not distracting people.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, well, as you sort that
Done.
out... Oh, done. Brilliant. That was quick. Excellent.
Yeah, I
Oh, no,
try
it's
to
still...
be...
Yeah, it's still coming. Now I've
Nope.
got infinite regress of you.
There we go.
Ah, there we go. Excellent.
Yep.
Thanks,
I
mate.
was just trying to get rid of that bar that says, "Oh, you're sharing your screen." Yes, I know I'm sharing my screen. You don't have to tell everyone. All right. So I got this up here in part so that way we can see what the name Moses looks like in Hebrew. Now, I also don't expect everyone to be experts in Hebrew, but the name here, Moshe, this is how it is spelled in the Masoretic text. It is the basic also way of how like a modern Israeli or Jewish person would pronounce the name, something at least close to Moshe with different accents, and I'm probably not
What
pronouncing
do you mean
it
by the
as good.
Masoretic text?
Oh, fair point. So when it comes to the Bible that we had for the longest time for the Old Testament, our oldest copies are from the 10th century AD. So way after the times that they're supposed to be describing. And the Masoretic text is particularly the form that was edited, or I shouldn't say so much edited, but adjusted in a way that made it easier for people to read. So for the longest time, more and more Jewish folks would have a copy of the Torah, but less and less of them would actually be generally Hebrew speaking. They might be speaking Aramaic or some other Semitic dialect or even a completely different language. And so more and more, the language of every day would drift away from the biblical pronunciation of these sorts of words. So the
And the
Masoretes were basically a
Torah,
group.
the Torah being the first 5 books of the Bible,
Yes.
known that's as the Jews would know it, but Christians would call that the Pentateuch, and we'll come on to that in a second. But yeah, you were saying about the Masoretes.
So the Masoretes basically make an innovation with notation to put all these various like dots and lines above and below the characters in Hebrew to let you know how to pronounce it, because originally everything written down are just the consonants, which makes it a little bit difficult to know how to pronounce. And even in modern Israel, you go there, most of the writing doesn't have any vowels. It's just the consonants, but you get used to it. You know exactly how to pronounce the word just because it's part of your everyday life. But if it's not part of your everyday life, you become less and less certain how to pronounce it. So a system was created to help someone look over it and figure out how to correctly pronounce those words with the correct little, what are called the vowel points or the pointing. So the various dots above and below are to help you know how to pronounce the vowels and sometimes also even the consonants. And I'll get a little bit into that. So off to the right here, you have 3 letters. You have Mem, Shin, and He. The Mem is on the right, and you read Hebrew from right to left rather than left to right as you're used to in English. And there are some various dots here that I have circled to basically point out what they are. So that dot that's a little bit to the left but above the Mem, that is called a Cholim, and that basically makes a long O sound. There's a set of 3 dots that's below that center character. Those 3 dots is called a sigil, and that basically makes an E sound. And then the W thing that's there in the middle, when there's a dot above it and to the right, that means this letter is a shin, and it's pronounced like SH, sh, sh. If that dot is on the left side, you pronounce it like a sin, the letter becomes sin rather than shin, and it's pronounced like an S.
Right.
So basic phonetics there, and then the last letter, a hey, basically is kind of like a rough breathing. It kind of carries the vowel sound. So in this way, a person could read this and say Moshe.
Right.
Now, we don't have these vowel points in manuscripts of, like, say, from the Dead Sea Scrolls. The system hadn't been invented yet. So if you pulled out a piece of Genesis from the Dead Sea Scrolls, there wouldn't be these various pointings. If you were looking at the Great Isaiah Scroll, wouldn't have that at all. Anything that mentions Moses would not have any of these points, because this wasn't a problem for them. Occasionally in Hebrew, they will add extra letters in there to act as vowel helpers, but Moses actually never had these extra letters added in. So the only way that we really know how to pronounce it is later the Masoretes adding these points, or we see it transliterated into other languages, so into Greek, into Syriac, things like that, so we can be reasonably sure that this construction of Moshe is not a 10th century innovation, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But the main thing also is the text describes how Moses gets his name. And as the story is told to us in Exodus 2, you got baby Moses has his life threatened by the regulations of the Pharaoh, basically saying, all right, there's just too many Jewish people in this country, kill all the male babies. Moses' mother doesn't want to kill her baby, so puts him in a basket, sets him into the Nile, lets him float down, where he is actually discovered by the daughter of the Pharaoh. So an Egyptian princess picks him and draws him out of the water and decides to give him the name Moses. And this name is derived from a Hebrew verb, masha, which means to draw from water, to draw out. Now, this already should strike us as weird. Why is an Egyptian princess giving a baby a Jewish name based on Jewish etymology? It doesn't seem like that would be the normal modus operandi of Egyptian royalty.
Yeah, that, I mean, straight away that gets you skeptical, bat sensations going.
Yeah. And also her knowledge of Hebrew must be immense, because this verb, masha, is actually super, super rare in the Old Testament. Outside of it being used here at Exodus, it shows up only in two other places, in 2 Samuel 22 and Psalm 18. And when I say in two places, I really mean one place, because one is a copy of the other.
Right.
So this verb really only shows up one other time, and then it gets copy-pasted. So how this Egyptian princess knows this super rare verb that's only other use is describing a story that deals with the King David, kind of a big mystery. But that's not the only thing that's a bit weird. So again, his name is Moshe, and this is taking the verb masha. So masha is in its infinitive form, and that's just basically a way of saying that it would be like when in English we have a verb and we aren't conjugating it. So like when we say he runs, I run, you run, the way we change our spelling of run, runs, run, things like that. If you say run, then you're not speaking well. But in the infinitive form, that would basically be to run. So masha is the infinitive form of this verb, and Moshe is when you turn it into a participle. So like drawing. And this is the active participle. That means the person is doing the action. And that's a bit weird because, again, Moses is being called this because he's the one drawn out of the water. So who is doing the drawing? The baby or the princess?
So the princess. So the idea that he's the active participle is also weird because it assumes that he is drawing himself out of the water type thing. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's even clear, like in the text, that he is the one drawn out. So it is not that Moses is flapping his arms and flying out of the water. He is the one drawn out. So if anything, he should be receiving the passive participle, and his name should have been Moshe, but Mashwi. And nobody ever called him that on the playground, as far as we know.
So does this hint at it being a post hoc rationalization, like an after the fact, like his name was Moses, and then they looked for how that name could have come about?
That is the most common sort of thing you will find in modern scholarship. But I will note that this is not an observation of just modern scholarship. Already in the days of Philo, in the 1st century AD, he's already looking for Egyptian sources for Moses' name. Already there seems to be some feeling that, hey, this doesn't really quite make sense.
Right. Because
Yeah.
there are, as you say, there are different theories, and some theorize that yeah, as you say, it's an Egyptian word, and Moses has its own meaning in Egyptian. But you'll come on to that.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's worth noting as well that apparently Philo really didn't know Hebrew, and his access to the Old Testament was almost completely in the Greek language. So it's a bit interesting when he goes and he tries to explain the Egyptian name of Moses based on the Greek translation of that name, or
Right.
transliteration of that name. It's kind of like doomed to failure that he's going to get the right etymology.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that nonetheless he was looking at Egyptian words, and apparently knew just enough Egyptian to make reasonable guesses. In particular, there's this word in Coptic that's pronounced mu, M-O-U, which is also like how it's spelled in the Greek for Moses. And what does mu mean? Water. And what is Moses? Well, he's drawn out of water. You can see how Philo would start making that kind of connection.
Right.
But this is not the way that modern scholars will go with this. Apparently, ideas of Egyptian names of Moses go back at least a couple of centuries in scholarship, but the perennial article comes from a Egyptologist by the name of John G. Griffiths. And I read this article, and there's one really interesting footnote. Is in the footnote to this article, he noted that he got funding to do this research by Cecil B. DeMille. Does that name ring a bell?
Yeah. So the famous film of the Exodus.
Yes, yes, he's the director of the 1950s version of the Ten Commandments. Now, this was a couple years before that movie, but clearly DeMille was, throwing money around to do research for this film. Uh, Interestingly enough, also it's worth noting
Wow.
the Ten Commandments technically a remake.
In what sense?
Cecil B. DeMille had already done an Exodus movie back in the 20s as a black and white silent film. So DeMille was basically remaking his own film.
Right. Fair enough.
So if people are complaining about remakes and no originality in Hollywood today, how about directors literally remaking their own films? And not in the
Nice.
George Lucas special edition, like straight up, we're going to do the whole thing again.
Well, I don't know. Special editions like going black and white to color. So there is that.
Yes, but fortunately there was no unnecessary in-your-face singing bad cantina scenes in Jabba's palace.
Oh,
Just saying.
harsh, harsh.
Okay, so nonetheless, a lot of the most modern attempts go back to this article from basically 80 years ago. And in particular, Griffiths is, I would say, assuming or at least relying on the idea that Moses exists historically, and he is looking at Egyptian words or names that would have existed at the time of the Exodus. Now, when did the Exodus happen? That is debated. There are different answers you can get depending on how you're reading the Old Testament, but generally you're going to get anything from about the 15th century to the 13th century, very, very roughly.
Yeah. So most
BC.
most sort of Orthodox Jews and Bible believing Christians will say probably the 1200s, maybe in 1200s BC. Yeah, BCE. So but it can be later or earlier than that. Sorry, it's so difficult when the numbers go up and you're going back.
Yeah.
But yes, so yeah, in that time frame.
Yeah, yeah. So in that general time frame, he's looking at like especially the names of pharaohs, because again, the story is that not only was Moses discovered by an Egyptian princess, but Moses basically grew up in the household of Pharaoh himself. And so most likely sorts of names he's going to get is the names that other royalty will get. And we actually have many examples of people with this component, this Egyptian component to their name, which will often be transliterated. I need more coffee, clearly. Transliterated as Mose. And you can see that in the names of pharaohs like Mose, Tutmose. And this is usually a name related to first some sort of god. So like the moon god. Tut is the same as Thoth. So related to birth and Thoth, related to birth and the moon. Or creation and the moon. So those are the sorts of names that have that theophoric element. Most people would say, well, perhaps Moses had a name like Mose, and the Jews who obviously are wanting to be proper monotheists are like, well, we got to get rid of this old god prefix to it. And so they drop off the they get rid of the tut and just leave the Mose. That's the main thesis that most people will suggest.
Fair enough. And are there issues with that thesis?
Well, one is actually in its favor. An issue in its favor is that you don't need to drop off the theophoric element, the god name element of the name, because we actually have papyri from the same time period of people who just went by the name Mose. So there are like administrators who literally just had that name without that element. So whether it was a nickname or his birth name, it's not possible to tell from there. But apparently there was nothing that unusual by someone going around ancient Egypt called Mose. Now, of course, I say ancient Egypt. I should be a bit careful. Ancient Egypt has like 3,000 years of history. And we are specifically talking somewhere between like 1500 and 1200 BC, which is such a tiny fraction of the entirety of Egyptian history.
Absolutely, yeah.
But it's also worth noting, because Egypt has 3,000 years of pharaonic history, basically, it also has many centuries of changes to the language. Just like the English that I speak is different than Jonathan's, and Jonathan's English is different than the English of Shakespeare, different than that of Chaucer, and so on. As you go back in time, the way words are pronounced or the grammar of things will change over time. And there are two issues in particular with the verbal root of this name. So I have in parentheses M, S, and Y. These are the consonants that make up that unit that is often to be called Mose. And Egyptian, just like Hebrew, just shows the consonants. To figure out what the vowels are is basically a gargantuan amount of detective work by Egyptologists that have been going on since the early 19th century. Basically since Napoleon decided to go into Egypt and is like, you know what, let's take some of this home. And then the British are like, that's fine, mate, but we'll take it for you.
Yeah, we're good at that.
Right. So there's been a long history of trying to reconstruct the language of the pharaohs, either using Greek sources, using Arabic, using later forms of Egyptian, especially a language called Coptic. And these reconstructions have led to a huge amount of legwork. So I'm basically just trying to say, here is the conclusions currently of the field of Egyptology. This is not original to me. This is what other people have pointed out. One is that there have been shifts in how various vowels were being pronounced in these words over time. And in particular, this same verb, spelled like MSY, in the days of the pharaohs that we're supposed to be interested in, like the days of Ramses and such, it would not have been pronounced Mose, but Masi, something like that. And you could tell instantly, well, that doesn't sound the same, does it? The vowels are noticeably different.
So what does that have, and how does that affect things? I mean, why is that important?
Yeah. So this would suggest that if Moses existed in, say, the 15th century, and he was being given a name, his name would not have been pronounced Mose or Moshe. It would have been Masi. And either he would have been a footballer, or at least he would have been called something a bit different than what he is currently in Hebrew. And this shift, though, of the pronunciation being closer to what we have, it goes from Masi to Mose, this Egyptian verb, only in between about 550 and 450 BC. And the important thing is, this is after the Jewish exile in Babylon, which means that if Moses' name is derived from this verb, his name could only derive from it after the year 500. So basically like 1,000 years after the time of Moses.
Right. Okay. So this is a very important component then.
Yeah. So, like I say, if you were going to actually use this argument to propose where Moses' name comes from, it would already suggest, oh goodness, it can't be that historical. But if the linguistic argument for this connection isn't that strong, you might just say this isn't how it works. And there's another problem is I keep saying that this is pronounced Mose in like around 500 BC, but that's Mose, not Moshe, as in Hebrew. So the difference between the S sound and the sh sound. So in linguistics, this is the wrong sibilant.
So again, what's the importance of that? What are the
Yeah.
ramifications of this?
Yeah, so the idea that if we're trying to explain Moses' name based on this Egyptian word, and the Egyptian word doesn't match that well, it has the wrong vowels and the wrong consonants, then it doesn't seem to be a very good candidate for what that name would have been.
Fair enough.
It makes us go, okay, let's look someplace else. What other options do we got? And unfortunately, there aren't that many other ones that are any better.
So I mean, okay. Well, first of all, what are those other options then?
So, another option that I had seen was using a different noun that has a few problems. One is that that noun that's proposed is only one syllable instead of two. So there's that. It also has the problems that it has the wrong sibilant, so it has a sound instead of a sh sound. It has the wrong vowels. It's basically everything I mentioned here and more. um, I did see
So
one other proposal that
just to go
is
back
looking.
though,
Oh, sorry.
like, yeah. So the idea that Moses is the actual name of
Yeah.
this supposed person, like, and are we sure that that is the case? That
Mm.
it is that was his name, and therefore that's always been his name, or could his name have evolved genuinely over time? I don't know. Like, uh, we might think of someone in ancient history now, or like say in English history. I'm just trying to think of an example. The way like Canicatus Tala in Chaucerian English is knight's tale, and like we might say knight, but they might have said Canicta then.
Mm.
Like we might say Moses now, but he might genuinely have had a different sounding name in reality at that time.
Right. Yeah, and that is definitely a one plausible way to go with that. And so you might say, well, are there other words that it could be connected to in Hebrew? But it still leads to two problems. There's still the narrative issue from earlier, the Egyptian woman giving a Hebrew name to him. The problem of the active and passive form of his name, that's still a problem.
Yeah. So
And if they're
if
also
it's all still to do with the root word of drawing water.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and it's still that that difference between active and passive and how the vowels change when you go from between the active and passive form of the name. You still have that same structure. So even if it's a different Hebrew word, you still have the same problem coming about. So if you're trying to say, well, maybe it's some other Semitic root, you still run into this same wall.
Right.
So that's why it seems like it's really hard to make any progress, even if you look at any other possible Semitic root. And if you hop back to Egyptian, at least, like I say, the most common proposal has all these other issues. So quite literally, the field is like, we don't know where the name even comes from. Maybe it's Egyptian, maybe not. We don't really have a good way to go, which, of course, is why I'm going to propose something new. But this is, like I say, what the current state of the field is on the most recent scholarship.
Yeah, and just to reiterate that the biblical account of where the name comes from is almost certainly wrong.
Yeah. The fact that it's so awkward in the context of this story does suggest that it has some sort of outside source and is being pushed in. So it still begs the question, okay, well, if it doesn't really fit in there, if it's a round peg in a square hole, where is the original round hole that it came from?
So is that to say that the biblical editors or writers or whatever, whoever put those sentences in there saying talking about the etymology of the name, were just basically just doing really crap phonetics or crap etymology, and were just erroneous in their claims?
Well, that could be possible, but in particular, if they're trying to make up a character, why make it up in such an awkward way? It seems like they have some legacy that they're trying to deal with.
Right.
Now, let's take a look at that legacy. Because I mean, we keep talking about Moses as if he's not a real person, but he wrote all these books. How can you say a person who writes books doesn't exist, right?
True that.
Yeah. Yeah. So obviously Moses existed. He said so. Well, allegedly he said so. Somebody said he wrote them.
Yeah, so famously wrote the first five books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, or the Torah, and we're going to look at some of the issues to do with that, such as the simple ones like writing about his own death, which is rather a bizarre thing to be responsible for writing, but also lots of claims. I presume you've got this coming, like claiming that he's the most humble person on earth or something like that.
Oh, yes.
The absolute classics like that. There are all these little pointers that would suggest he didn't write that, as well as what is now generally accepted in biblical scholarship, although some evangelicals will refute it. But there are different multiple source theories, and actually there some people adhere to another version of what's called the documentary hypothesis, and you can explain that really briefly in a second. There are things like the supplementary hypothesis. There are different versions of the documentary hypothesis, but I think it's now beyond any reasonable doubt that there are multiple sources to the first five books of the Bible, so that it is just impossible. It's practically impossible, using any decent reasonable evaluation that a single person could have written the first five books of the Bible. So yeah,
exactly. Yeah, and those five books are supposed to be Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. Again, traditionally these are all supposedly written by Moses, but modern scholarship, since the 19th century in particular, proposing a multitude of authors, and which theory is best and how it all works is extremely complicated. But the traditional view of what's called the documentary hypothesis, that you have these four primary sources. I should say not primary in the sense that they're historical, but primary is in you have these four disparate sources that are interwoven together through either one or multiple layers of redaction, and putting those all together, you get those five books of the beginning of the Bible, as well as more beyond that. So in particular, the sources are given the letters J, E, P, and D. J is for Yahwist. And how does a J sound like a Y? It sounds like a Y because it's from German. The original proposal of the documentary hypothesis was from a German scholar, so we go with that.
Yeah, Julius Wellhausen, I do seem to remember.
Yes. Yeah, Wellhausen, in the 1870s,
Wellhausen,
80s, something like that, his master proposal. And most versions of the documentary hypothesis are some variation on Wellhausen, who himself was adjusting earlier proposals. But J is supposed to stand for the Yahwist, and E is for the Elohist, P for priestly, and then D for Deuteronomist. So Yahwist and Elohist is suggestion of, hey, these are actually different names for the Almighty, for God. And often apologists will say, oh, they're just saying there's different sources because here they're calling God by a different name than in other places, and that's the only criteria. That is not just a simplification, it's actually false. It's not so clean that the Yahweh source will never use Elohim as a way of referring to God, and it's not the case that the Elohist source will never refer to God as Yahweh, or Adonai, as others might want to say instead. But this was like one of those early things, in particular when you were looking at Genesis, and you are noticing all sorts of little differences in there. Many people will start reading Genesis 1, go into Genesis 2, and then you get a little bit of Genesis 2, and you feel like, deja vu, is God creating the world again? It's already, it's like you don't even have to get that far into the book and realize this looks like an edited job.
Yeah, so the flood stories, that's a really interesting and it's a closed book as far as I'm concerned. With regard to multiple sources, you've got these two different accounts of the flood story that are just spliced together kind of almost thoughtlessly, and it just doesn't make much sense. It's either 40 days and 40 nights or 150 days, or it's like 2 of each animal, 7 of each animal. It's like, you make up your mind, and it's because there are two sources within that. And I think, you look at people like Joel Baden when he does analyses of this, is like it's pretty obvious. This is one of the most obvious bits of evidence for multiple source theories.
Yeah. And really the only argument that's even worth having is how many of these sources are there? It's more than one. and how exactly was the editing done over the centuries. That is basically where all the debate really lays.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So some people combine J and E and say there isn't a difference between J and E. Some people don't. But then on top of those four sources, if you agree that there are four sources, you then have the editors who are editing at different times. So there are different editors who then bring their own baggage to the bringing together of all these sources. So it's interesting. You know, there are multiple layers. Just out of interest, Constellation Pegasus, I don't know if he's referring to the Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai issue. Can't remember the mountain or city Moses mentioned, but it's called by different names supposedly when Moses wrote the Pentateuch or the Torah. I don't know this, but in the Torah they mention Mount Horeb and and Sinai. Supposedly in the same story, but they're arguably two different places. So again, that hints at multiple sources. Evidently the text was written later and not by Moses. But anyway, I think he might be talking about something else, which is an anachronism rather than a flat out contradiction.
Yeah. When it comes to, like, in particular, when it comes to whether God's encounter, or sorry, Moses' encounter with God was at Horeb or Sinai, the naming, looks contradictory. Could it be that the same place has multiple names? I'm leaning towards the idea that actually they're using both names for the same place, because like Horeb can basically be used for like a place that's desolate and desert-like, and Sinai, that word actually sounds very similar to the word for bush. And so they went to the desolate burning place, found the bush, and so you kind of connect the two words together for that location. So it could be a pun. And as a person who loves dad jokes, I can appreciate biblical puns.
Yes. So basically, it's. I mean, we could spend 4 hours talking about the documentary hypothesis, but let us assume the truth of multiple sources for this, which would very clearly say that not a single person wrote the Torah.
Yes. Now, also, I have here divided up a little bit just to see where the various things that Moses was supposed to have said and done are kind of spread out. So, for example, the birth story of Moses, at least traditionally, comes from the E source. But his first action, killing an Egyptian and then running away, that's from the J source. The priestly source is not just things throughout the Pentateuch, but the entirety of the book of Leviticus is considered priestly. So that if any book has one author, it's Leviticus, but it's basically the giant list of the law. So it's maybe not the most fascinating read in a narrative sense, though obviously there's plenty of scholarship done on Leviticus. Deuteronomy has also, interestingly, Moses' last speech and his death, which will become quite a bit of a trick if Moses wrote that. One other thing is well worth noting, and we do currently notice in our manuscript, is that there is basically no real strong agreement on when these sources were composed or when they reached their form before their final edit into the Pentateuch. So there are just gigantic error bars that you should have. Traditionally, the J source was considered the oldest, and I think Wellhausen put it basically in the court of King David. It's really hard to know if that's true at all or not. Now, if it is true, and J is talking about Moses, then it's okay, well, Moses has existed in the written record since roughly 1000 BC. But since we don't know how old the stuff in J is and how many edits had gone through there, it's really, really hard to know how far you can actually project it back in time. We don't have the paper trail to really lay that out.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I was just looking. I've got a book there, which is Friedman's The Bible split up into all the documentary and all the different colors for all the different sources. And I was just trying to find that, but I couldn't. Nonetheless, so there's some interesting things, and I don't know if you're going to come on to talk about this, but you can throw into. I don't know whether it's worth just explaining that critical scholars these days claim that the Bible was actually written in what's called the Exilic period. So the kind of Jewish people were exiled, not all of them, but a large proportion of them were exiled into Babylonia during the 500s BCE. And during that time, it is thought that, so bear in mind that the tradition says that Moses was alive in either the 1200s or up to the 1500s BCE, right? And so therefore you would expect the Bible, or at least the Torah, to be in place at that time, right? Yet there are others, more critical scholars, as I say, that will claim that when they were in exile in the 500s, so this is maybe 700 to 1,000 years later, they didn't have a holy book. They didn't have this national identity, this something to bring them together as an exiled people. And it was when they're in exile in Babylonia that the Bible was written, that the Hebrew Bible was written, and that gave them that sense of national unity and a sense of identity. But it also explains why you start seeing stories from that context, from Babylonia, written into the Hebrew Bible. And we'll go on to talk about King Sargon of Akkad and the birth story. Yeah. But you get these stories that are then much better explained in light of it being written in the Exilic period rather than 700 to 1,000 years later. But then you have other bits of evidence, such as the Elephantine papyri, which are these interesting papyri that were discovered in the 600s BCE that had, so these are written by Jews kind of in some Egyptian,
actually even later,
Egyptian
because
border.
These documents were written in Aramaic primarily and during the Persian period. So this is after the exile in Babylon and when Egypt was controlled by Persia. So this goes, like, I think the last of the Elephantine papyri that talk about Jewish people there is from like close to 400-ish BC.
Right. So, but what's interesting about these documents is that they make no mention of any of the big figures of the Bible. Like none of the early biblical father figures, the Abrahams and the Moses. And Moses isn't mentioned in the earliest kind of Jewish religious text, if you like. I mean, it's not a text as in a holy book, but like extant literature that we had. It makes no mention of these big figures, which then leads towards the theory that actually this was created in the exilic period. It defends that because there's no evidence of these stories existing. In fact, the Elephantine papyri suggest not an Orthodox Judaism at all, but a kind of syncretism where they've got elements of lots of different religions within their kind of is a polytheistic kind of belief system that they have. So really interesting documents, considering they are far, far earlier than our earliest extant kind of religious texts with regard to the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah, and also to add to that, when it comes to the archaeological record for looking at that, I should shout out for this book, The Origins of Judaism by Jonathan Adler, looking at the Elephantine papyri as well as various other archaeological finds to point out that basically what we consider like the Mosaic Law being actual practice on any sort of measurable scale doesn't really seem to show up until the 2nd century BC, basically suggesting that it seems to really kick into high gear during the time of the Maccabean period. So when Judah Maccabee and his family basically going and trying to push out the outside Greek forces from controlling there, and then it seems to be in that sort of time that what we consider now normal Jewish mitzvahs really came into practice. And before then, not so much.
Yeah, and interesting. So I've written a chapter on that in the book, in the manuscript that we have, where you look at the law codes for the law codes within the Bible. Most people know the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, which aren't necessarily 10, but there are other law codes in the Bible, such as the Covenant Code, the Deuteronomic Code, the Holiness Code, and whatnot. But we find the precursors to those codes in like the Code of Ur-Nammu, the laws of Lippet Ishtar, the Code of Hammurabi, which is a very famous one, lots of other earlier codes, the Hittite codes. So there is the idea that suddenly the Bible was written and it has no connection. There's no intertextuality that connects the Hebrew Bible to these other cultures and other things that came before it. That it was suddenly like created and put there by effectively by God and by these particular awesome holy people like Moses, is just pure nonsense. You can see the evolution of these ideas and these stories that infiltrate into what we now know as the Hebrew Bible from these other cultures, and that is made even more sense when you understand that actually it was probably written outside of that geographic area and in some of these other, in this one of these other cultures, in the Babylonian geographical area, and that's why we have the Hebrew Bible as we have it. But sorry to interrupt.
No, that actually though leads into probably something we need to highlight is other reasons we can be sure that whoever wrote these various books, it probably wasn't our friend Moses. And so, like, besides the entirety of all the evidence for the documentary hypothesis and the fact that there are multiple authors putting together the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, let's also note a few things that are just weird if we thought Moses really had his hands on these sorts of things. So, for example, you go through, you read the various stories, you read the stories also about Moses, and you'll notice every time Moses is there, he's being talked about in the third person. So, for example, in Exodus 5:1, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said to him, "Hey, let my people go." Notice that it says Moses and Aaron go. It wasn't my brother and I went to Pharaoh. There's nothing here that suggests that the narrator is the same person as one of the characters in the story. And that's at least a little bit weird if Moses is writing this as like some, grand memoir of all of his amazing stuff, and he just talks in third person the whole time. That is at least unusual behavior.
Yeah. Occasionally you might be, playing a game of sport, I don't know, a game of tennis or something, whatever you like playing. Oh, come on, Pierce, you can do better than that. But generally, you're not going to write this kind of book in the third person.
Yeah. The only sorts of persons who do that are literal Seinfeld characters.
Yeah.
There's also things that it's worth noting. So, to remind everyone, the story is that Moses will lead his people to the promised land, but Moses himself will never enter the promised land.
Yeah, this is such a good argument as well. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is at the very beginning of the book of Deuteronomy, the setting is set up where Moses is basically rallying the people, and they are, as it says in verse 1, on the other side of the Jordan River. And different English translations might render this a little bit differently, but in the Hebrew, the literal reading there, Bevar Har Yadin, is literally saying in the lands beyond the Jordan River. And that context would suggest that whoever is writing that sentence is writing it from, well, that other side of the Jordan, the inside of the Jordan River, basically Israel, where Moses never went. Whoever wrote that sentence could not have been Moses, because that would contradict the Moses story.
Yeah. And I think that's pretty. I mean, at the very least, you would have to have an editor, like editorial, editing that to be from their point of view. Which, at the very least, you've got other sources involved in the manifestation of this text.
Right. And one thing that might also be a bit hard to believe Moses writing is this completely lacking self-awareness sentence if it was written by Moses from Numbers 12:13. Now, Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth.
Imagine writing that yourself without a smile on your face. Like, I often use this gag to like friends. I'm like, I am the most modest person you will ever meat. It's an obvious joke, but
yeah, I mean, it is literally part of the lyrics of Amish Paradise by Weird Al Yankovic.
Right, classic.
Yeah, so like, unless this is supposed to be a joke, this could not plausibly have been written by Moses.
Yeah. And then, of course, he talks about his own death,
Yes.
as you point out here.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that not only is he talking about his death here, but it's also talking about it as if it's like in the distant past, because it says like things like, and no one to this day has ever, knows where his grave is. No one like to this day has seen anyone like Moses. It's really suggesting there's a huge amount of time between the composition of that sentence and the death of Moses.
Yes.
So this isn't like Moses like writing this down beforehand. This is clearly being written as if it's in the past.
Very good
There's
point.
also one other thing worth noting, because I only recently learned this and I had to triple check this. If you are reading this in Hebrew, the text would suggest that the person who buries Moses is God, because it basically has Moses alone chatting with God for one last time. He dies, and then he buried him in Moab, and that he, from the context, would have to be God. But in the Septuagint, the Greek translation, it's actually conjugated not he buried, but they buried. And apparently the realization there is, wait, God is supposed to always be perfectly pure and clean, but touching a dead body is impure. So there's no way God could have handled this dead body and buried him. It must have been somebody else. So they literally changed that word from he buried to they buried in the Greek, which is actually just changing one letter in the Greek to get the conjugation to work. But nonetheless, they decided it's like, nope, we need to put a little bit more separation between the Almighty and that corpse.
Just a little philosophical sidebar here. Thank you again, Constellation Pegasus. And this is a great point, something that I've often sort of mentioned. This conversation is another example how the Bible fails. It makes no sense that the creator of the universe would have a text written. So today there would be so much arguing over it. It's emotional torture and cruel. It's really sad. It's such a good point, this, because like if you are producing this text as the most perfect revelation, and yet people can pick holes in it and find all these issues, and people don't agree on it. Even believers don't agree on it. So they will get different interpretations and therefore different worldviews coming out of this. Then it's just not a very good revelation. Now, if you're the perfect God, how are you using an imperfect revelation to try and do your thing? Absolutely agree with that.
And it's a strange thing that I have to give credit to New Age believers who will say that they actually have revelations where they're accessing not ancient holy books, but what they'll call the Akashic record, which is basically some sort of writing that exists in the astral plane that you have to access by other metaphysical means. But if you think about it, isn't that actually better than having it have to be copied by hand over and over again and people making all sorts of edits over thousands of years? So credit where credit is due. The New Agers, the Theosophists, the mystics of the last couple centuries have a better story in that particular way.
Fair cop. So where do we go next then?
All right. So far we're talking about where Moses clearly is in the story and where he's traditionally supposed to be writing. But I wanted to explore something that was, like I say, was first pointed out by a rabbi, and I had to investigate it to see how it held out, and was surprised by the result. I wanted to see, okay, what can we actually do to trace the Moses story over time? And of course, we don't really have much of a paper trail where we can actually look at how the documents were being written differently when it comes to the Pentateuch. We don't have anything older than the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that would only take us to maybe like 200 BCE. And I think that's even well outside the range that most would date anything from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Most of it is past 200. Some of it's in the 1st century, etc. So how can we talk about, well, what was the story of Moses in 900 BC? What was the story of Moses in 500 BCE? And I tried looking to see what sorts of things can we actually solidly date by whatever internal means, and then see how the story progresses in both the Exodus story and the Moses story. And so the sources that actually might give us the best way of moving forward are the various prophets. So once you've got past the Pentateuch, you've gotten past the book of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Kings, etc. All of that history, you get this big section.
So these are all
are
the quasi historical books before that, which are purporting to talk about the kings, and obviously you've got the Torah as well, talking about the creation of the universe and onto the kings. So then you get the prophets.
Yeah, and because the at least a number of the prophets will give the sorts of details that seem to actually put them in a particular political context. Some of them even will date exactly when they have these various visions. In particular, Ezekiel goes out of his way and he says, in this year and this day, I was doing this and I got this vision from God. And I would, of course, be initially skeptical that these dates can be reliable, but there are some things that give me enough reason to suggest that it's plausible or even likely. And I would say especially with Ezekiel, because famously, Ezekiel gives prophecies that are failed. Ezekiel knows they failed and then gives updates to the prophecy that also failed. So in particular, Ezekiel has this
Quality
prophecy,
prophet,
this condemnation of against the city of Tyre. And Tyre is being sacked or attempted to be sacked by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. And Ezekiel says, yeah, Nebuchadnezzar is going to come in, kick butt, take names, absolutely decimate and destroy Tyre. And we know from other sources when the siege of Tyre happened and that Nebuchadnezzar failed. So Ezekiel was wrong about that prophecy about Nebuchadnezzar taking Tyre. And we also know Ezekiel knows that didn't happen because you go a couple chapters in and you have basically Ezekiel saying, so Nebuchadnezzar didn't get what he needed from Tyre, so he's going to instead get his just desserts by going to Egypt and getting his prize there. But then Nebuchadnezzar goes to Egypt and also completely fails. So you actually get not a successful prophecy, but you get two failed prophecies, one trying to fix the previous one. And that makes me think, okay, what's the chances that someone in like the 2nd century BC would make this up? This looks more like Harold Camping trying to come up and re-explain themselves as time goes on. So this makes me think, okay, the dating of Ezekiel's prophecies are believable enough to accept them. And the other ones, the other prophets that I have listed here, we have at least some internal ways of having good reason to place them. So there's 3 basic categories of where I'm placing these prophets: pre-exilic, exilic, and post-exilic. So in the central thing is the Babylonian exile, when Babylon basically came in and destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and took lots of people from the Holy Land to have them live instead in Babylonia, basically to try to snuff out that culture. It's a common tactic in the ancient world to ultimately destroy your enemies by diluting them out so much that they can no longer have a coherent fight against you.
Yeah, and as I was talking about earlier, and that's a good reason to think that maybe the Torah was written at that time, because when you're under the kosh and you have no national identity and you've been exiled and you're feeling like away from your home and isolated, then that's a really good motivation to give yourself a national story.
Yeah, exactly. And so the question is then, well, how did that national story develop over time? So I've listed not all of the prophets, but quite a few of the ones that are of importance to this. And I've created a bit of a key where they're in italics if they have some sort of Exodus tradition, and in gold if they have something to say about our buddy Moses. And there's 2 observations worth noting. Quite a few prophets in the pre-exilic period have absolutely nothing to say about the Exodus. I also had to split out the works of Isaiah that modern scholarship suggests that Isaiah is not a single work, but actually is in 3 stages: Proto-Isaiah, Deutero-Isaiah, and Tritio-Isaiah, written at different times. And even Proto-Isaiah also has various edit jobs over the years as well. But the first chunk, chapters 1 through 39, that is mostly written by Isaiah or a secretary of Isaiah writing down what he said to various kings. And if you are going through all of Proto-Isaiah, he says nothing about Moses, and there's only a couple passages that seem to suggest any knowledge of an Exodus tradition, and a fair bit of scholarship would suggest that these are actually later additions, which would mean Isaiah, one of the most famous of the pre-exilic prophets, apparently either doesn't know about the Exodus story or thinks it's of such little importance he never brings it up in these 39 chapters.
And this is not, so there's, one must be careful because certain people say, well, that's an argument from silence, but arguments from silence are valid. So in other words, just because you don't hear about it doesn't mean it didn't happen. Is so some people call that kind of fallacious thinking, but actually if you would expect it to be there, then it not being there is disconfirmation of it. So for example, if like I came to your town, Aaron, and you said, "Oh, there's a earthquake 7.5 on the Richter scale yesterday," and I walked around your town and asked everyone in the town whether there was any evidence of this massive earthquake, and everyone's like, "No, we haven't heard about it." And then I looked around; there were no shaken buildings, no broken windows, everything like this. I looked around everywhere. Then that silence, that lack of evidence is disconfirming of your claim. So I'd go back to you and say, you said there's an earthquake 7.5 on a Richter scale, and actually no one said anything about it, where I would absolutely expect them to have mentioned it, right? And because they haven't mentioned it, that is actually a disconfirming, is evidence of disconfirmation of your claim. So if we would have expected Proto-Isaiah to have mentioned the Exodus accounts, and it's not mentioned, then that is disconfirmation of the Exodus having taken place or being known about
right
at that time.
And also, when it's not just Isaiah that's silent about it, there's also another contemporary of Isaiah, the prophet Micah. There's one passage that seemed to suggest knowledge of Moses, but there's also good reasons to suggest that that's a late addition. So if you exclude that, then Micah knows nothing about Exodus or Moses. So that's two prophets who are living in the same time period and have nothing to say about it. Now, there's also worth noting, at about the same time, there are two other prophets, Amos and Hosea, who are writing roughly at the same time as Isaiah and Micah. But there's one thing to note. At this time, you have a divided kingdom. The Holy Land isn't controlled by the single monarchy like it was allegedly during the time of King David. You have the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Amos and Hosea are from the northern kingdom. Isaiah and Micah are from the southern. So Amos and Hosea have at least a few things in their writing that show knowledge of an Exodus tradition. And they're in the north. Isaiah and Micah don't, which would suggest whatever the Exodus tradition was, it must have started in the north and only later came to the south after the northern kingdom was destroyed and people fled to the south. And in particular, the prophet Jeremiah is basically a descendant of one of the tribes that came from the north to the south. And a lot of Jeremiah is literally also, you could tell, cribbing from Hosea directly. So you see the transition of it going from the northern kingdom tradition to a later southern kingdom prophet, but also at a late stage. Jeremiah is also writing at basically the tail end of the pre-exilic period. He's basically around when the temple finally is destroyed by the Babylonians. So he's like right at the edge of the pre-exilic period. And only then, that's the only Judean prophet who mentions an Exodus tradition at all at this time.
Yeah.
So that is already suggesting, okay, we can actually see that there is some movement
Evolution
of the story.
Yeah.
But also, it's lacking Moses altogether. Again, there's one passage in Jeremiah that seemed to mention Moses, but a fair bit of scholarship suggests that this was a later edit by the same person who probably wrote the book of Deuteronomy. It has like the same kind of verbiage.
Right. Interesting.
So then we decide, okay, it's now exilic time. The Jews are literally in exile, begging to be free. Sounds almost exactly like the Exodus story. And we see basically more and more highlighting of that sort of Exodus tradition, especially in Ezekiel and perhaps most clearly in Deutero-Isaiah. There's actually a couple places in Deutero-Isaiah where you see things that look almost exactly like the parting of the Red Sea story. You have basically God coming in, strong wind, dividing the sea, saving his people. But I also mentioned that Isaiah brings it up twice, and in one version, it's not so much God is splitting the Red Sea, but he's fighting a big effing dragon.
Yeah. Which is that, I haven't looked into this for a long time, but would that be any idea of sort of taking on board like Baal sort of stories of like storm gods and stories that were associated with Baal and then assimilating that into the Yahweh story?
Yeah, because it looks like it's based on the very ancient creation by combat myth, where you have some sort of warrior god who's usually some sort of storm deity, and using storm powers, especially things like wind, to defeat some sort of monster of chaos and kill the monster, rip it apart, and then create the known world. And you even see that somewhat echoed in Deuteronomy, or sorry, not in Deuteronomy, in Genesis, where um, you have the spirit of God coming over the waters. When we say the spirit, it's literally like the breath of God in that sort of way. And then you have the splitting of the waters. This is also very similar to many other creation accounts where the waters are split by taking the corpse of that sea monster to basically help divide the waters above and those below to create the sky and the dry land and the ocean surrounding all of that.
Which again is like, could be an element of, if you're a believer in Baal, taking the Baal stories and putting them into Yahweh. So it's a way of convincing you to believe in this as Yahweh as being the main God, or it's a way of saying our God Yahweh destroyed your God, was much more powerful, and therefore you need to believe in a more powerful God. So there's several ways you maybe you could look at that. But anyway, carry on.
Yeah, yeah. So, so it's a bit interesting that you basically have this imagery of the creation of the universe as described of how God is saving his people. So it looks less historical and much, I shouldn't say much, it's clearly mythological, the way it's being described in that sort of way. And so, like, this is the first time you really see, like, a parting of the seas sort of tradition as part of the Exodus story, and it is pulled from mythological language. And again, in this exilic period, the prophets that talk about this never mention Moses once. Not even allegedly. There's no examples of Moses in there, even though many scholars will point out, hey, Ezekiel seems to know a lot of the material that we call the P source and the D source. He seems to know stuff from the priestly source. He seems to know stuff from Deuteronomy. Heck, in particular, Ezekiel seems to be quoting from what's called the Song of Moses. It's in chapter 32 of Deuteronomy. Ezekiel seems to know that, quote from it, build on that, but he never seems to know the name of the prophet who was supposed to have given that song, allegedly. It's kind of weird. It's only finally until you get into the post-exilic period that any prophet mentions Moses at all, and only a minority of them mention it. So when you get to the last part of Isaiah, Tridio Isaiah, do you finally get a mention of Moses. In Malachi, which is usually like one of the last prophets in the list of prophets there. And in Daniel, you finally get mention of Moses and the laws of Moses. But I should also note, Daniel is a complicated work. There's half of it
arguably very late. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. But it's also worth noting, like, Daniel has like two halves. One is in Aramaic and one is in Hebrew. The Aramaic section is perhaps older than the Hebrew section, maybe by a couple centuries. And it knows nothing of Moses. Only the Hebrew section, which is definitely late, probably, like the 160s BC, is approximately when you would date that. And only then does it mention a Moses figure. So you have to get well into the post-exilic period until Moses becomes the talk of the town. And even then, not even by that many prophets. So like Zechariah has nothing to say about Moses. Several of the other post-exilic prophets have nothing to say about Moses. It seems really weird if Moses was supposed to be like the most important, figure in all of Judaism, and he only starts even getting talked about centuries later and even after the exile.
We cannot overemphasize how important this is, because like if you were to think back now on with your knowledge as a Jewish person or a Christian person of the Bible, and to think that you would be writing about any of these ideas without reference to Moses. Moses is so integral to the whole narrative that the absence is, as we say, this is not a fallacious argument from silence. This is a problematic argument from silence, whereby this looks to be disconfirming of the existence of that story of Moses as a concept until very late in history.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, yeah. And then, of course, we add additional sources that seem to show no awareness of this. You mentioned the Elephantine papyri that seems to show no awareness of Moses and his laws. They, like, among the things in the Elephantine papyri that kind of like blow you away is they apparently had their own temple to Yahweh in their location. And Elephantine is this little island on the Nile River, basically in southern Egypt. So, like, really, really far away from the Holy Land. They had their own temple, which very much goes against the laws of Moses that says there will be one and only one central location for that sort of worship. And that temple and the Jews there weren't worshiping just Yahweh. They had several other gods that they tithed for, that they worshiped for there. And apparently they thought so little of this being against the laws that when that temple ended up collapsing on them, they actually reached out to the Jerusalem temple to help get funds to rebuild their temple. They weren't thinking like, guys, we are so out of our depths here and so against the laws that we better not even let anyone else know. They're just like, oh, hey, our temple broke down. Let's see if we can go build another one with help from the central authority.
Which is again like evidence that those laws didn't exist because they hadn't been written at that time.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it is interesting nonetheless that we can see that like there are things in the Pentateuch that do exist before the end of the exile because Ezekiel shows awareness of them, but it also shows a whole lot more work must have been done on them, and it took a long time before they became normative for Jewish people.
Yeah, yeah. So such I love this stuff. It's so fascinating. Carry on.
All right, yeah. So here we see that, okay, Moses is important, but not important enough to talk about until like the 400s, the 300s. It's really even hard to know. And these last sources, these post-exilic sources, the only one that we have like confidence dating is Daniel. When third Isaiah wrote, it's hard to get anything definite. All we know is it's after the exile. When did Malachi write? After the exile. But when exactly, very, very hard to date. We don't have any clear references in that can help us like pinpoint to like a year or a decade. Deutero-Isaiah, we can much more clearly date because he talks about Cyrus coming in and basically being the Messiah for the Jews. Worth noting, only one person is ever called the Messiah who wasn't Jewish, and it was the Persian king Cyrus, because he basically ended the Babylonian exile for the Jews. And he's literally called Mashiach in Isaiah. And that also helps us date when Deutero-Isaiah is writing, because, well, he's talking about Cyrus the Great. When did Cyrus the Great live? Here. Okay, that's probably when Isaiah was writing. Or this Isaiah was writing.
Absolutely. Right. So, you know, the theory is starting to take real form here that Moses is looking like a late construction.
Yeah. Yeah. And the important thing is there's already an Exodus tradition. It appears to be an Exodus tradition sans Moses. And already we noted that, hey, the name Moses already looked like it was kind of like shoved into that context in ways that's a little bit awkward. So it now allows us to say, okay, maybe Moses is a later addition. It then, of course, makes us go, well, where can we find him? What is the earliest datable source that mentions Moses? And we actually have to go back to Egypt. Now, we don't have a document in Egyptian from olden times that talk about Moses, but we do have various people traveling to Egypt, especially after the conquest of Alexander the Great, and people going in and recording all sorts of things about Egyptian beliefs and practices. You already had earlier than that, like Herodotus, a famous father of history, writing all sorts of Egyptian legends, but he never mentions anything about the Jews. But later historians, or later writers do. And in particular, there is this figure by the name of Hecataeus of Abdera, who writes this big book about Egypt. It's called like the Egyptica. And it's dated to somewhere around 310 BCE. We don't have the exact work. We have it quoted in other sources. And this is just a big chunk of text that's taken from a 1st century BCE work by Diodorus of Sicily and his library, the Library of History by Diodorus. So there had to be some work done to try to parse out what stuff probably came from Hecataeus and separate out that from other authors. And this in particular, I'm relying on the work of Russell Gmirkin for filtering this out. So I've got this big wall of text here for us to look at and basically see how Moses enters into the story. And I'll just give you the highlights for this. Moses wasn't Jewish. He was an Egyptian through and through, an Egyptian man of, as it says, outstanding in both wisdom and courage. And he went and settled into Judea at the same time the Egyptians were sending out other colonies around the world. In other parts of Diodorus, he talks about how the Egyptians were allegedly sending colonists all the way to Babylon. So the Babylonians are actually Egyptians. The Greeks are actually Egyptians, and so on. Basically saying, well, if in this time, 310 BC, Egypt no longer has like control over itself, so the best they can do is basically say, but we're the root of all culture. So we're culturally superior, even if we're not politically superior. That's kind of what looks like is happening here. So,
but did that actually happen? I mean, that isn't what happened. They didn't spawn these other civilizations, right? So that.
Oh yeah, it is. In fact, if anything, we can actually tell that it is Babylonians that gave their culture to Egypt. If you look at the oldest Egyptian art, it shows clear Babylonian influence, and only later does it take on a form that is distinct from the ancient Near East in the other ways.
Interesting.
Yeah, so if anything, it's quite backwards, but nonetheless, in this story, it basically is saying Moses was an Egyptian, and he left Egypt not because he's leading his people out from slavery, but he is helping to go and establish a new colony in what is Palestine. And he goes in and he founds a number of cities, including Jerusalem. He sets up the temple there. He sets up the priesthood that's based on merit. He establishes various laws. He creates the system of 12 tribes because there's 12 months in a year. Does all this, warring and, establishing things there. And among other things, the Egyptians will say the reason we know that the Jews are actually Egyptians is that they circumcise themselves. And that's actually a holdover from Egyptian culture as well. So they have all these sorts of arguments about how they know the Jews are actually Egyptians. The interesting thing, though, you read this, and there's two things that are striking. One is that this text, as is, other than basically saying the Jews are actually Egyptians, it's not really directly anti-Semitic. It's not saying, like, the Jews are terrible and they have all these sorts of things. Like, no, they're actually just an offshoot of the Egyptians in the same way the Babylonians are. And the story it has of this Moses character, this isn't some bad dude who left Egypt in ruin. He's a good, honorable Egyptian who is expanding its cultural hegemony.
Interesting.
And also, it's kind of hard to imagine whoever believed this knew the biblical story. In particular, Moses found Jerusalem. That is doubly against the biblical narrative. Moses is supposed to have never even entered the Holy Land, let alone set up Jerusalem. In fact, according to the conquest narrative, Jerusalem was already a city established in the Holy Land that then had to be conquered.
Well, so what do Jews, modern day Jews and Christians do with this story then, and this mention of Moses?
Well, from what I can tell, for the most part, it really isn't part of the discussion because the date, it's 310 BCE. This seems so clearly late. That it must somehow be riffing off the Moses tradition from the Bible.
Right.
But
so it's like, so what you're proposing is it's the other way around. So you're saying, look, but because I assume, sorry, correct me if I'm wrong, but you assume like Christians and Orthodox Jews are saying, right, we are going to start with our conclusion, which is, so it's arguing in a circle, begging the fallacy of begging the question, which is, I assume the truth of the Bible. And so therefore, Moses is this figure who's true to history, and he was in this period of 1200 to 1500. That is true. So when I look at this text here, and it has Moses existing in 310 or whatever it is, and it's some guy writing about this and blah, 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 blah. They say, right, obviously a riff off the real Moses. It's all totally inaccurate. It's a load of rubbish, blah, blah, blah. Whereas you're looking at this and saying, what you think you know about the traditions of Moses are completely wrong. And actually, this is the earliest extant evidence we have of a chap called Moses existing. And therefore, you need to understand what you think is correct, your traditions of Moses in light of this.
Right. I will note as well, though, that even like in modern critical scholarship, they'll also probably consider this late because they will think that, well, Moses is at least mentioned in the various Pentateuchal sources. Some of those are pre-exilic. They're definitely older than this. Therefore, something about Moses existed before then. Now, that is a reasonable argument to make, but that does assume we know what the state of those sources looked like in the 7th, 8th century BCE, and frankly, we don't. I think you actually is one of the things you highlight in our current book manuscript is that Joel Baden like goes out of his way to not date any of the sources because he knows we have no reason to be confident about any of these dates.
Yeah.
And so it's like,
He hates talking about dating the sources. Yeah.
yeah, and I agree that, like I say, to use it in more sciencey terms, you have really big error bars, and I think it's inappropriate to use something with very large error bars to then force a data point and how to interpret it when it has much smaller error bars that were much clearer about where it goes. Because this is a identified source by name in a time period that we can actually coordinate on by multiple ways, so that we actually have reasonable good grounds to know when this story was created, and also that this story was a relatively recent invention. Because as I mentioned, Herodotus doesn't have anything to say about Jewish people at all, and he doesn't have these stories about Egyptian colonists going all over the world. This seems to have been a development after basically Egypt gets its butt handed to it first by the Persians and then by the Greeks. And at this point, the Greeks are now completely controlling Egypt. And this story itself is actually following Greek forms of how cities and colonies are farmed. So it's very Hellenistic in its conception.
Right.
Which is another way of saying almost certainly that this story only started to develop in the period after Alexander the Great, and he conquered Egypt in 332 BCE. So I would say, like, I want to start with where we have solid footing rather than the places where our footing is uncertain, and build hypotheses on that. And also, the other thing is, if you read this text, it looks independent of anything in the Pentateuch. It seems to not even be aware of the biblical story, even as a counter-narrative. I mean, the only things it has in common is the name Moses and something to do with the Holy Land. But everything else, it just looks so different that it's like they're not even, the two stories aren't even talking to each other.
I mean, could it be that it's just how it happens that this is another chap called Moses?
Well, maybe.
But then I guess
it begs the question. It begs an interesting question. If this is another chap named Moses, where did his name come from? And what does the name Moses mean to an Egyptian?
Yeah, so I was going to then say that, well, you did say that there were people called Moses before that, though.
I mentioned that there were people named Mose, but there was no Moshe.
Right, yeah, okay.
At least no one was able to point that out until today.
So the name itself is suitably rare or suitably like non-existent anywhere for it to be really unrealistic to think there would be two concurrent stories about Moses, about someone called Moses.
Yeah, and importantly, the way that these narratives are also running is that the names are supposed to have some sort of explanatory or etiological power. Yeah. So, for example, in the story that the Egyptians have for the Babylonians and how they are founded, the colonist who led them from Egypt to Babylon was a man named Belus. And Belus is basically a way of saying Baal.
Yeah.
So it's Baal is leading them off and becoming their worship deity. Danius goes and founds the Egyptians, and already in Homeric times, another way of referring to the Greeks is they are the Danians. So this is a bit of etymology to explain that. So what is the etymological value of calling this colonist named Moses? And that is how I decided to try to search for a candidate for Moses' name in Egyptian. Is there some sort of word that is close to Mose, Moshe, Moses? Is there something close to that that could explain this Greek source as well as our Hebrew source that we know so well, but would make sense in an Egyptian context?
Right.
So that's how I'm trying to restrict my argument to what sort of sources. And I started looking in Coptic dictionaries, and I found this word. And it is spelled with a mu, two upsilons, a shai, that's in a Coptic letter, and then an e or epsilon. And it is pronounced Moshe. Does that sound familiar?
I've heard that name before.
Yes. Now, it is almost identical to the Hebrew pronunciation Moshe. The only difference is where the accent is placed.
Yeah, the emphasis.
And
Moshe rather than Moshe.
Exactly, yeah. And that's a pretty small difference. And honestly, I think that can be explained by the fact that generally in Hebrew, the accent is on the ultimate or penultimate syllables, usually towards the end. And while in Egyptian, it was kind of the opposite. And it's just following what is normal for that. Now, what does Moshe mean in Coptic? It, as a verb, can mean to go or to travel. As a noun, it can be a journey or taking a step. And, well, what does this Moses figure do in the story from Hecataeus of Abdera? He goes from Egypt to the Holy Land to make a colony. He's basically the traveler. He's the one who goes on this journey to establish that colony. Also, this verb actually has some other interesting valences that, according to the other dictionaries I looked at, that said this word also has some valences that it's related to laws, both human and cosmic. So a person who travels and is a lawgiver, that's a pretty nice connection. Now, the older form of this word, it comes from a Demotic term, and I have the Demotic right next to the Coptic there. And that same collection of consonants also is used for another word, not Moshe, but Meshe, which is the word for army. So a person who has an army, who establishes laws, who travels, all with the same set of consonants, like the same root word is behind all of that. So it seems like a pretty strong connection as I'm finding it.
This is just to reiterate, this is that Greek story of an Egyptian person journeying out in the 300s BCE to do all this funky stuff that isn't, as far as we can tell from any kind of history, true, right? As in, this is still some kind of, not mythological story, but legendary tale, I guess, something like that, of this chap, and etymologically, as in, you know, a story that gives sort of meaning to things, sort of written in order to give meaning to something. The story is, or at least the name is provided to give meaning to this person.
Exactly. Yes. So yeah, my main 2 points is, one, the name makes sense in its context, and 2, it also then explains the fact that we see these other spellings of Moses in Hebrew and in Greek that can be explained if it is derived from this earlier Egyptian word. Well, at least that's my argument. Now, here is where there is a problem. So Coptic only starts like showing up in the written record well into the Common Era, like 2nd, 3rd, 4th century AD. So that's way too late. You got to go back in time to find the same verb being written in the earlier writing form known as Demotic. So just so everyone knows, when it comes to Egyptian, the oldest forms of writing is the hieroglyphs. Later, there's a simplified version, basically a cursive way of writing hieroglyphs called hieratic. This then later kind of develops into an easier to writing system called Demotic. And later on, under a lot of Greek influence, another writing system develops, which is Coptic. And along the way as well, there's not only just the change in the form of the letters that are being written, but in Egyptian, in ancient Egyptian, in hieroglyphs, in Demotic, they only write the consonants. And some of the consonants will also drop out completely when you get to Coptic. Now, I have to highlight one consonant in particular. So you see in that text box right next to the M-O-O shy, that thing that looks like a W with an extra line on it, and then a little E symbol. The thing next to it, there's an M, there's an S with a little swoop thing above it, and then there's another little half circle next to that. You see all of those?
Really don't know where I'm looking.
Okay, can I get a pointer? Yes, all right. So right here.
Yeah.
All right, so this is a way of transliterating the Demotic. So there's this M, there's this S with a little swoop thing over it, and then there's this little character here. So this M is pronounced like our English M, basically. This S with a line over it, this is how you get a sh sound. So about an aspirated sort of S. And this last character here is the equivalent of the Hebrew letter ayin, which is in modern Hebrew basically unpronounced, but in ancient times it had a tiny bit of pronunciation. In linguistics, it's called a pharyngeal fricative voice.
Fricative,
Sorry.
fricative.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So it's a voiced glottal fricative, and
Yes.
so it's pronounced
So
kind of
it's
like
like
a. Yeah.
I get into this problem. So I've talked about these fricatives in when I do my Ukraine war videos, because I have a separate channel that does that. And there's a place called Vuhledar, and I pronounce it incorrectly because I can't. I'm just rushing through, and it's the VUH, and that's that fricative, voiced fricative, which is
Yeah.
Vuhledar, and I just end up going Vuhledar. But yeah.
Oh yeah, and I'm definitely not pronouncing it accurately as well. So I'm pointing it out, one, so that way those who can pronounce it well will do it correctly, and two, this is also probably the biggest weakness in my hypothesis, because this would have been much closer to what the pronunciation of that verb would have been in the time of Hecataeus of Abdera's writing. And if a Hebrew person is listening to that word, you would think they would write this down, and they would also include an ayin in their writing. And if that's where Moses comes from, then why is it spelled with a mem, shin, and he, rather than a mem, shin, and ayin? It doesn't make sense as is if we're doing a direct transliteration. So this is probably the biggest weakness. Now, here is how I try to argue what's going on there, because at this point already my hypothesis is better than the previous one. I can explain the vowels correctly. I don't have to worry about when did the vowel shift. This works at the time that I'm looking at. I don't have the wrong sibilant. I have the sh sound instead of the s sound. So already I'm doing better than the original proposal by Griffiths from 80 years ago. Now, to explain one vowel properly, that ayin is hard to, first off, me to even make the sound. And when you also have it next to another letter with this sh sound, it might kind of get lost when you're listening to it. And even more so, because the ayin is a voiced fricative. So the difference between voiced and voiceless is if you're using your vocal cords. So basically, if you have your hand around your throat and you say s, you don't notice much. But if you say v, you'll notice a bit of vibration from your vocal cords. So the difference between voiced and voiceless is if you're using your vocal cords or not.
Right.
It looks like, at least later in Demotic, the ayin here was actually being devoiced. And so it wasn't even a voiced fricative, but a voiceless fricative, to make it probably even harder to notice. So what I have here along to the side here, this is normally how an Egyptian would write Moshe or Mashe in Demotic. And so this letter here is basically the equivalent of M. This is the equivalent of SH. These two characters here together is the equivalent of the ayin of that voiced fricative. And one thing that Egyptian is interesting, this right here isn't pronounced. This is called a determinative. It's basically a way of telling you what kind of word it is. And this determinative is supposed to actually be a foot or a pair of legs to suggest moving or walking. It's actually more clear if we go to the original hieroglyph. So right above here, this owl with an arm on it, that's an M. This box is the sh sound. This arm right here alone is the ayin sound. And then you have the walking legs here. This looks much more like legs, doesn't it?
Mm.
And this is the determinative to say this is a word related to walking or going.
Interesting.
So we're learning Egyptian today, aren't we happy?
Yes. Woohoo!
All right, so this is normally how it's spelled with this ayin. So you'd think it would be noticeable. But like I say, it seemed to be to some degree in the process of being devoiced. There's even, I found some versions of it. So here's another papyrus that is very, very roughly from like the 400s BCE. And instead of it being written with an ayin, it's written with the voiceless fricative in its place. And you see it also has this here is another way of writing the same determinative as a foot. So this might be the same word, but just spelled a little bit differently for phonetic reasons. Or it could be that somebody goofed in writing it. It's hard to know for sure. But perhaps the most important thing, imagine you're a Jew and you are hearing this word being spoken while you're living in Egypt. You hear someone say Moshe, and your ears may not be perfectly tuned to all the different sounds of Egyptian, and you hear something that sounds a whole lot like a word you know in Hebrew, Moshe.
Right.
So my hypothesis is this was close enough that someone who is listening to a foreign language, and especially if that language is being spoken at them at normal speaking rate, those tiny little subtleties might get lost and say, hey, it sounds closest to this word I do know.
So you could have some story about a Moses chap being mentioned by Egyptians that
Mm-hmm.
the meaning for his name might then be triggered in a kind of Jewish person hearing that name and then taking on that kind of story and using it for their own ends type thing.
Exactly. And it would also then explain the awkwardness of Moshe in Hebrew, because now you're going from the Egyptian context where it can make sense to now having to be forced into this new story where the person hearing it hears this verb and says, hey, this sounds a lot like that verb for drawing out of water. And this then becomes the basis of the story where originally, like I mentioned, there's only one other place where the verb masha is used in the Old Testament, and it's describing God saving King David by taking him out of the waters of chaos, drawing him out of waters. So if you hear this name about a Jewish leader who is Masha, and then say, well, that sounds a lot like our Masha, all right, then that could be the trigger for this narrative of him being drawn out of water.
Which itself, and this is another very famous story or a bit of intertextuality going on here, where you've got King Sargon of Akkad, who's a Babylonian Mesopotamian king who predates, interestingly, predates Moses by some time, and in fact, the story predates the extant kind of Moses story by a long period. I mean, there are different arguments concerning this, but the idea is that you've got an earlier story of King Sargon of Akkad where he's floating down a river and in a pitch basket and picked out of the river by Aki the irrigator, if I'm correct in remembering, and then brought up and then becomes a kind of kingly person, etc., 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 and becomes the King Sargon of Akkad. And you're like, what are the chances of these two stories existing independently? Like, and then we get onto lots of interesting, and I talk about this in one of my sections in the book, where you have like pitch didn't really exist in Egypt at the time of the story, and there's lots of arguments. It gets quite technical about that. I've written to, and I've written against Dave Armstrong, who's a Catholic apologist. We've argued about pitch ad infinitum about this, but basically, I would posit that pitch wasn't readily available in this area, but was much more available in the Mesopotamian area, and it makes more sense to have a pitch basket floating down a river there. Who would put a baby in a pitch basket and float them down the Nile where you've got crocodiles? You're like, I don't want this baby to die. So what I'm going to do is put it in a basket covered in pitch that doesn't really exist around here, float it down a river full of crocodiles, right? Because that's the best way of keeping this baby alive. And then it gets, picked up by someone and then, drawn out of the water and then gets to live, a privileged life in an Egyptian court. And it's just like, if that's not stolen off that other story, which is an earlier story that's essentially identical, then I don't know. The idea that both of these stories could somehow independently exist is absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, I will say that if it's not the case that it's a direct lift of the Sargon of Akkad story, that version of that way that a hero is born must have been extremely widespread, because it's also used for the birth story of Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome, who were also as babies basically put in a basket to float down a river and then were saved by a she-wolf and then later raised by a farmer. And it might even be more widespread, because a similar story is actually told.
So what in India?
Because I mentioned this the other day in the story from Journey to the West. The main holy person in the story, a guy by the name of Tang Sansing, as a baby, his life is also threatened. So his mother places the baby on a board and floats down the Yangtze River until he's found and taken in by a monastery where he grows up to become a holy man.
all similar kind of motifs. I just got a bit of a super chat question. Eventually came a super chat. So John Fox, just trying to work out if I understand this correctly. Is Moses an abbreviated version of the original name, with the deity aspect dropped? So like Tutmos, like we
Yeah.
talked about earlier.
Yeah, we mentioned earlier that, yeah, there are names like Ahmose, Totmose, and it is possible that an Egyptian could have had just the name Mose. We do actually have literal papyrus with people that had that as their name in court documents. So whether that's a nickname or their birth name, it's hard to say for sure, but apparently it wasn't unusual to be just called Mose, or the pronunciation at that time would have been Mase. And it means that you don't have to explain the name of Moses as a shortening of a previous one, but if we did go with the hypothesis that originally his name was Ra Mose, for example, then the Ra part, the theophoric element of his name, was dropped because that goes so hard against worshiping only, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Yeah, so I mean, you start putting all of these threads together, and you just seem to get a late story that is stolen and in exilic times from a surrounding culture, and then applied to this person that might have been some bastardization of something that like a diaspora community, maybe a community like the Elephantine papyri community, had heard
Yeah.
in Egypt, taken that idea, taken some of these stories, run with it like a traveler guy, yeah, so on and so forth,
Yeah.
and developed into.
Well, one thing to note, though, that this would actually place the origins of Moses even much later than the time of the Elephantine papyri, because the oldest mention of this Moses is from about 310 BCE, and the Elephantine papyri go to just about 400 BC. So we're talking at least like a century later that he could have even entered Jewish consciousness.
Yeah, I
Now,
mean, in fact, you don't hear about them in the Elephantine papyri. It says an
yeah,
awful lot, and then that gives you this window where that story can develop.
yeah. Now, so far, I would say, though, that while I have a hypothesis here that I can fit to the evidence, I want to find more direct evidence. And I have to also point out there is one other Egyptian source that does mention Moses. And this actually comes from an Egyptian priest by the name of Manetho. He's writing in the 3rd century BCE, and we have chunks of his writing because they are quoted at large by Josephus.
Right.
Now, this is also like the source of where people will go to and try to show that the Hyksos were the original Jews that were part of the Exodus tradition. They'll use that sort of thing. But Manetho has a separate narrative about someone who is living a couple of centuries after the time of the Hyksos, and who leads this revolt against the normal Egyptian hierarchy, this guy by the name of Osarseph, who apparently establishes some sort of monotheism and just like absolutely devastates the country with an army of lepers. And according to Manetho, he was also called later Moses. It looks like there was this other story of this Osiris character, and then kind of just globbed on, and he's also Moses too. Just like throwing that on there. It's a completely different narrative than the one we have from Hecataeus of Abdera. So it seems like it's a bit forced together. And more importantly, Manetho's story seems to actually be a variation on the story, not of Moses, not of the Jews or the Hyksos, but another, in some ways viewed as a tragedy in Egypt, the time of Akhenaten and his religious reforms. So we got some interesting stuff there. But like I say, he also tries to connect this to a Moses character. And the thing I want to highlight as interesting positive evidence...
Sorry, can I just... I'm just trying to get my head around this. So
okay.
There is just some other random story that this person, that Manetho, wants to throw the name Moses onto. Like, what would be the motivation for that? Would Manetho be thinking... There's a story about Moses, and I've heard that name. What's going on there?
So, in the narrative with this character of Osarseph, so two things. One is that he will actually join forces with the Hyksos people that were kicked out and have them basically come back in to help him in his conquests. And afterwards, he and all of his followers will basically be kicked out and run all the way to the Levant to try to escape, their final crushing. So there's also this kind of connection with Palestine.
And an Exodus.
So that seems to be part of the connection. Why? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, carry on.
Yeah. Now, the reason I also want to highlight this is not only is he the only person who mentions Moses, but this is an Egyptian talking about Moses. So originally, Hecataeus, he is a Greek coming to Egypt and writing stuff. And when Manetho writes, he is writing as a local, so he knows, he can read Egyptian, he can read the hieroglyphs, he can translate things to Greek. So he's this really super important resource for doing things like reconstructing the order of the pharaohs. If you're trying to actually like do Egyptology, he's like a major source that's not in Egyptian itself. And the thing that's interesting is that he actually spells the name Moses differently than Hecataeus does. Now, why does this matter? It's like, really, am I going to get on somebody's spelling, 2,000 years after the fact? Today? Yes. Because the way he spells it is a different way than is normally spelling is done in Greek, in Hebrew transliterations into Greek. He spells it in the way as if the name itself is Egyptian. So when he spells Moses, he spells it with an omega and an upsilon. And this is apparently an Egyptian practice of vowels that Greeks don't normally use, that Jews don't normally use. This seems to be something we find specifically in Egyptian papyri for Egyptian names.
So in other words, what you're saying is that when Manetho uses the name Moses, he is using, it is being used as an Egyptian name etymology rather than this drawing the water Hebrew kind of etymology that the Bible is trying to espouse.
Yeah. So when he hears this name, to him it sounds like an Egyptian word, and he spells it and it's an actual indigenous Egyptian name.
Yeah.
And one other feature that's a bit interesting is the fact that he also spells it with an eta and a sigma. So the eta is the long E sound in Greek. And the thing that is actually a bit interesting is that in Manetho's writings, where he's talking about most of the pharaohs, he usually spells it those names with an iota and a sigma. The only exception that I found with what quotes we actually have of Manetho is when he is describing the pharaoh Khafre. And the reason this is interesting is that Khafre, Re, is spelled with an ayin, just like Moshe does. So I think this actually shows some evidence that that ayin is there that gets lost when it's otherwise translated into Greek or into Hebrew, but it actually does exist there. Manetho is hearing it, and he's trying to fit it into Greek the best that he can.
Interesting.
And also to compare this, that like this is not the normal way that a Jewish person would actually spell Moses. So we actually have other spellings of Moses from other sources, and I have two examples down there, and they're totally different. And nonetheless, interestingly, if you go to the Septuagint, the original translation of the Old Testament or of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, it uses the spelling Moses as found in Manetho, as if the person translating it knows Manetho or knows other Egyptians who spell Moses in the Egyptian fashion.
So
this, and along with a few other things that I try to highlight,
shows that this certainly doesn't disconfirm your hypothesis and looks to support it.
Yeah, it looks like a bit of evidence that the Septuagint translators know of this Moses character and of this particular spelling, and that spelling looks much more of Egyptian origin than Hebrew. And in particular, it also fits this being a transliteration of the Demotic word that I have been pointing out, which also then explains the etymological foundations of the Moses story in Egyptian sources. So I think I can explain the data the best and say this is where Moses comes from. He's originally an Egyptian, and he then gets turned into a Jewish leader when he basically is brought over into the Exodus story.
Which Ombedoel Dekut, probably not done justice to that, says, do you think the Exodus was more so about the Exodus from Babylon around the time it was written? So you've interestingly said, you've mentioned there are elements of the Exodus story that are in pre-exilic prophets writing, but they aren't particularly strong. Like, it's not the whole narrative of Exodus, it's just elements of the story of part of the story of the Exodus camp. And I would agree with this question, or the inference of this question here, that I think the Exodus represents, coming out of bondage, which is exactly what happens in the exile and after the exile. So it's this either a desire to come out of bondage, or a representation of that story of coming out of Babylonian exile and back into the Holy Land.
Yeah. So what I think, though, is that because an Exodus tradition does exist before the Babylonian exile, what the Babylonians did cannot be the origins of that tradition. But I do think it definitely developed and became a linchpin during that time, because it seems like already there was this idea that we were in bondage in Egypt, and God took us out of bondage. We're in bondage in Babylon now. God will save us again. And you can imagine how that can give strength to a community if you can say, we already had this pre-established story, and now we're going to really hammer it home. But it certainly did seem to exist centuries earlier. And where that tradition comes from is then its own interesting question. And I'll just quickly note, my current running hypothesis is that there's an interesting piece of information in the prophet Amos. So Amos is writing in the 8th century BC. He's one of the oldest, if not the oldest, prophet writing in the Old Testament. And when he describes a little bit about the Exodus, he suggests that it wasn't just the Jews that were actually saved from bondage, but also other groups, including the Philistines, were also taken out of bondage by God. And that becomes a bit interesting when this is now not just a special relationship between even just Semitic people, or let alone specifically the Jewish people, and God Most High. That you also have the same God helping out other people that are attached to the same territory. So that becomes a bit interesting. And if you try to project back all these times when these groups are supposed to be saved, I think the kernel of truth behind it is what is called, forgetting the exact term, but the first Dark Age in the ancient world. Basically, the Bronze Age collapse. That's what I'm going for. The Bronze Age collapse, when basically a bunch of the world powers are completely falling apart or even disappearing. And it's also at this time that Egypt is now completely barely surviving, shrinking in size, and going from having control over the Levant. It's now been basically completely given up to other local people to be, quote unquote, free again. And I think that is probably the linchpin, and that would explain why it's not just Jews with a Exodus tradition, a coming out of bondage tradition, but also apparently Philistines and other groups, according to Amos.
Because there are lots of theories that are floating around. So I quite like the idea that there are people who were in bondage. So there's no evidence of mass bondage in Egypt. Basically, there is no decent evidence that the story that you see in the Torah of the Exodus account, the story of Exodus, happened at all. Historically, there is no evidence that, if you're going to believe the biblical claims, upwards of maybe 2 million people, given men, women, children, and then you got, beasts of burden and livestock and all this stuff. There's no evidence that many people were in bondage in Egypt at any point. But there are some little things that we can look at, like the Amarna letters, which are some letters from an Egyptian outpost that seem to indicate that they had captured an escaped slave trying to get back into Canaan. So I think a Canaanite, basically saying, we got this slave, what should we do with them? One or two, I think it's one or two. So literally,
two.
Two. You got two people that were caught that were slaves, because you had slaves around at the time. This wasn't it's not that slaves weren't a thing. You had slaves. We caught two of them. Should we return them? What should we do with them? That type of thing. so we've got maybe some evidence of Canaanites being in bondage broadly at around some time period that could be associated with the story. Then you might think something like, well, imagine we lived in a community and we had some of our community were enslaved and they escaped, and then you kind of think about maybe this guy was called whatever, but eventually gets to be called Moses. You can imagine that there's this development of a story where this guy becomes like superhuman amazing, and then bananas always, like fish always get bigger when you in the telling of the story. So these things develop, and then you have that story then mixes with, like you're talking about the north and the southern kingdoms. These stories mix with other stories and they get assimilated and evolve, and eventually you've got some kind of Exodus story which has some kernel of truth, some elements of that. But was there a bloke called Moses? There might have been some dude who escaped from Egypt as a Canaanite or something that then gets written over hundreds of years into this much grander story.
Yeah. And that's definitely plausible, but I will note where I think that may not explain the data very well, because one is, if this, escaping slaves is the origins of that, why is the tradition in northern Israel but not in the southern kingdom of Judah?
Yeah.
It seems a bit odd with that, especially if you have to go through the south to get to the north.
Yeah.
But it's probably worth noting as well that
but of course, sorry,
sources...
that they could be in bondage not to Egypt though, but to somewhere else.
Yeah, and that was, I think, true for some of the other groups that Amos mentions that were in bondage but then taken out of bondage by God. But again, that seems to be a northern Israelite tradition, not a southern Judean one until later. And I think maybe part of that is because there wasn't really a people group that was like codified beforehand. So in particular, another Egyptian source worth noting is the Merneptah stele, where this is the oldest mention of a people group called Israel, or most likely a reference to that. And that, for what I understand, most scholars will say this is talking about a people group, not a nation, and it looks like it's in basically the northern part of Palestine, basically modern day like Galilee kind of region. So if there was a people group existing there, but there wasn't an identified people group in the south, then there wouldn't have necessarily been a coalesced people there that could have actually talked about being in bondage in a coherent sort of way, that we are a people and now we are free. But in the north, if there was a people actually self-identifying, and then they became quote-unquote free when Egyptian control of the land was lost, then that could explain why there's a narrative in the north and not in the south.
Interesting. What else? Is there anything else to add to your thesis at all that you haven't mentioned? Anything else that you think is pertinent to this discussion?
So again, it's worth noting that I have submitted this to a journal to be refereed and see if it's actually up to par. So everything I have said should be, again, realized that it has not been examined by experts either in biblical studies or Egyptology. So please approach it with the level of skepticism you ought to, that some bloke on the internet with an irrelevant degree is talking crap. Please take that into account. But I will also note that there are other folks who have been coming to the conclusions that much more and more of the Old Testament was composed or finally edited in the what is called the Hellenistic period, after the time of Alexander the Great. So I make several mentions.
In other words, definitely post-exilic.
Oh yeah, way, way past the exile. So like even like 200 years after the exile. And so that would, of course, make it so not only is the Moses character a late invention, but even later than what most biblical scholars would suggest. Now, I need to, of course, note that the position that the Pentateuch is finally like written or composed in that time is not a majoritarian view, but if my hypothesis holds water, it would definitely add weight to that, because if it depends on the Moses character and Moses exists no earlier than like 310, 320 BCE, then it has to be a Hellenistic composition.
Awesome. Yeah, and this then plays merry havoc with traditional understandings of the Bible, and really plays merry havoc with the whole narrative and the whole historicity all sort of falls apart. I mean, there's so much we can talk about. I can just show you. I mean, this is a very early manuscript, but if I just show you this. This is basically a working manuscript. You can see that some of the chapters that we've been working on, the whole chapter about pitch and camels as well. Like, you know, the idea that camels are mentioned as beasts of trade and burden, but that's an anachronism because in Egypt they didn't exist at the time. And so if the Bible is throwing them into these stories, which is what you might expect if you were writing the Bible in the Exilic period, because during the Exilic period they did have camels in Egypt, but during the period that Moses was supposed to be alive, they didn't have camels. And so that's an anachronism, which shows that it's a later construction. These kind of arguments, I mean, you know, there's so much to talk about and lots of chapters still to add into this. It's just, yeah, it's a pretty exciting book project. And I think, awful lot. I mean, this is just what we've done tonight is touch on just the name. Just really the name of Moses, where that's come from, and what that better supports. I mean, you've got is competing hypotheses. So it's about a probability assessment of like, well, the one hypothesis is that what the Bible says is true, and the other hypothesis is that what the Bible says isn't true. I mean, that's as simple as it gets there. And pretty much everything you look at, it leads one to believe that the second hypothesis is far, far more plausible, that what the Bible says is not true. Yeah. So, well, look, thank you very much, Aaron, for that. I don't know if anyone has any other questions concerning either what we talked about or anything to do with the Exodus story before we kind of go our separate ways. I do appreciate the live chat that's been going on at the side. It's interesting. So, I mean, just to give people, I mean, this is probably teaching grandmothers to suck eggs, but what I love about archaeology, says Ombedo is how it sheds light on how much of the literature was speaking allegorically about things happening at the time. Just a bit of basics about archaeology. So biblical maximalism is this position that you start with the Bible as being true. And what happened in the 1800s is archaeologists who were employed by seminaries were sent to like the Levant to dig up stuff and paid for by the seminaries. So the seminaries are saying, right, you're going to dig up stuff that proves what we all believe in the Bible, right? And so they start with the truth of the Bible, do the archaeology and say, we found this in this strata, and we know that David had a united kingdom at that, even whether that was a case or not. It's like they're assuming that's the truth, dig up this stuff, and then date it to the Bible. And so that's biblical maximalism, which kind of shows that the Bible is maximally true. Like everything about the Bible is true, and when we do our archaeology, we are just proving the Bible. Whereas biblical minimalism is like, right, let's throw the Bible out. We just almost forget the Bible, do some archaeology, and see what we find. And on occasion, it might accord with something in the Bible, but generally, the Bible isn't true. Or we're certainly not starting with the premise that it's true, and that's biblical minimalism. And then you get, anywhere in between. But what's also interesting to note, which is kind of, sorry, there's a lot of me talking here, Aaron, but
No.
But this question reminds me of the idea that, and you said something earlier that I almost came in and said this earlier, which is we don't know, and this isn't so much to do with Moses, but we don't know the audience, and we don't have the experiences of the writers of the Bible. Any book in the Bible, Old and New Testament, Hebrew Bible, Christian Bible, whatever. There is language used in the Bible that makes that makes reference to things that we don't understand, and so we don't get some of the references and some of like how these texts might hit home to the audience that it's intended for, because we are not, and it's so important to remember this, we in 2023 are not the intended audience of basically any of the books of the Bible. Like the intended audience are the people that were there at the time who have those lived experiences that are being referenced and being spoken to in those biblical books. And so actually the Bible really shouldn't speak to us in the way that I think believers expect it to. And there's language used that just won't find purchase with us. It won't mean things to us because it's not intended for us. Sorry, that's me just going off on one, Aaron. I don't even have anything to add to that.
I
No.
think I'm on board here, so no additions on my part.
This is another very kind Constellation Pegasus super chat. Thanks, mate. Aaron, any possibility of making a presentation on radiometric dating one day?
I don't believe in radiometric dating. You can't have a meaningful relationship with carbon-14.
Would you like to explain yourself?
Dating, like romantic dating, it won't work. See, this is what happens when you invite someone who's has basically two things up his sleeves: physics knowledge and bad jokes. You get one or the other. But to be more serious, I probably don't have much that I can say here that others have not said better than I have. So, for example, Erica or Gutsit Gibbon on her channel, she has done a lot on radiometric dating and heat problems related to creationism, and other channels I think have already paved the way for really good, solid presentations on how radiometric dating works, how we can validate it, and the fact that we can also cross-validate it, so we can use like multiple methods on the same thing to get the same date. I could try to put something together, but I think I'd only be repeating what other people have said better than I could.
Yeah, I mean, you know, dating is a bit of a problem for creationists for obvious reasons. When you date anything for further back than 6,000 years, that is a bit of an issue. And so it's always about trying to pick holes in these processes, but they never really hold those criticisms. And yeah, science wins out, I think, in the end. But yeah, no. So we are. Thank you very much, Constellation Pegasus. We are definitely looking at you know, trying to work our way through this book. It's a long-term project. Aaron's a very busy man. I'm insanely busy at the moment. Um, but luckily I've written most of my stuff. But what is going to be interesting is having written this 3 years ago, and things are always being found out, and new scholarships being done, and Aaron's doing his work, but then looking over what I've written and saying, actually, this changes that, or there's what's lovely about writing a book together, and I know this because we've just written a book together, as many of you will know. We've just written Aliens and Religion, Where Two Worlds Collide, assessing the impact of discovering extraterrestrial intelligence on religion and theology. An awesome book. Please, guys, go out and grab that. It's such a lovely process writing with someone else. It's not lonely. You're bouncing ideas off each other. You're checking each other's writing. It's just a really wholesome experience. So I really appreciate writing with Aaron, and hopefully, you know, we can get this project done and dusted by 2030.
I get the feeling we will get done before real evidence of the Exodus is discovered.
This is true. And yeah, what's your favorite? Okay, to leave it here then. What's your favorite critical bit of evidence? I guess critical analysis that would lead you to conclude against the historicity of the Exodus. What do you like?
Oh, okay. I got quite a few choices. So we have satellites that are able to show ancient travel routes for like trade groups and things like that. So you can follow the various camel paths that people had made for trading silks and jugs and things like that. But we can't find the leftover pottery when millions of people moved out of Egypt into another country that can't even support millions of people, and they all somehow settled and destroyed all these cities, including cities that weren't even established places at the time or didn't have walls to conquer or things like that. Can I just say all of archaeology and just put it on the table? Just the whole thing?
What single thing do you find the most? Everything. Like the whole story, nothing. Yeah. I mean, but it's true. Like every single element of the Exodus story is contestable. Like you can contest every. So yeah, as you say, millions of people wandering around Kadesh Barnea, the wilderness there, for 40 years without finding their way out. We've got evidence of contemporaneous Bedouin tribes people, like just a handful of people we can find archaeological evidence, but 2 million people wandering themselves in a circle in Kadesh Barnea for 40 years.
Yeah.
Zip, like no evidence, like zero evidence, like nothing. And that is that, again, this is a really valid argument from silence. So if you would absolutely expect to find that evidence and you don't find any of that evidence, that is disconfirmation of that, because you cannot have it that there is no evidence of that. Now 40 years is a symbolic number in the Bible, so it's not going to be 40 years, but it's going to be some time. I mean, they're given sustenance of manna to allow them to, or it is 40 years because it's such an important number. Like, you can read that either way.
Well, actually, I think we're kind of forced to read it literally because it's a punishment by God to make it so all of the original people coming out of Egypt will all die off and only their descendants will enter. So it can't even be. It's like, well, he said 40 years, but he just multiplied by 10. It's like, no, the time period was supposed to be established for the sake of killing everyone off, including Moses, before entering the Holy Land.
And so you look at every element of this, like the parting of the Red Sea or the Reed Sea, depending on, you know, what you think it is. You think, no, it can't have happened, didn't happen. You look at the philosophy of the Pharaoh's heart being hardened, like that can't have happened, or at least if it did happen, God is just a complete bastard. The 10 plagues of Egypt are the most disgusting. It's a horrific story, an absolutely horrific story that an omni-God, an all-loving, all-knowing, all-powerful God just wouldn't have done. And so every element of this story, you piece it together. Like, it's the acceptance in the Bible that magic does exist outside of your accepted religious confines. So you've got, you know, Aaron doing this magic stuff with a crazy stick, and then the Egyptian people matching him, like miracle for miracle. It's like, so you do accept that people can just basically do magic then that aren't anything to do with miracles coming from God. So it's either God is allowing those miracles to be done by these non in-group people, or magic exists. Like, which one is it? So every element to the story is just absolute nuts. Anyway, I'm liable to just go on a big rant.
Well, that's what YouTube is for, right?
Yeah. It's why I have these channels. It's rant o'clock every day, all day. Anyway, look, thank you, Aaron. It's been great talking to you. I really am interested in your thesis, and of course interested because it's going to hopefully be a chapter in the book. But so many really cool chapters in the book. Really exciting project. I'll leave the final words to you before we go on our own exodus to elsewhere.
There is an actual joy in trying to figure out the truth behind these stories. And when we are done, you know, we're going to have our hypothesis. We're going to say why we think it's the best hypothesis, but we don't want to be dogmatic about this. What we will instead be dogmatic about is the search is worthwhile, and our approach is far, far more effective than any fundamentalists will ever provide.
Yeah, I think the only thing you can dogmatically say is that it damn well didn't happen like the Bible claimed it did. I mean, I you know, and not being dogmatic from an ideological standpoint, but just from an evidentiary standpoint, it just couldn't happen, and it didn't happen like that, and that is definite. So the question, as you say, is, well, what is the most plausible explanation for the genesis, pun intended, of those stories? And that's hopefully, you know, one of the questions we'll seek to answer in the book. Thank you, Aaron. Really appreciate you and your time. Thank you to all of those who have supported the channel, Constellation Pegasus, particularly Mitch Mazarol, as ever, John Fox. I really appreciate your support. Thank you, and hopefully you got something out of this chat. We'll probably have another Exodus chat or 10 later in our lives as we get on with the process of this book. But in the meantime, everyone, take care and speak to you soon.
Bye, everyone.